Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Tollerton. I'm a principal with Forvis Mazars. Appreciate everyone joining us today to talk about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and specifically an update on the 32 CFR rule that was just published as final in the Federal Register and takes effect later this year, which effectively makes CMMC officially a program within DoD. So we're going to talk about the implications of that rule here today, and I'm really excited at the panel that we have to talk about it today. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. For those of you that may not be familiar with our firm, Forvis Mazars is a top 10 public accounting and professional services firm internationally via our Forvis Mazars network. We're also one of the earliest CMMC third-party assessor organizations, or C3PAOs, the firms that are authorized to conduct the initial assessments. And we'll talk about what that means here a little bit later. But we were the sixth authorized, and we're just about to be, we believe, reauthorized here after completing our 3-year assessment with DoD and DIBCAC again. And we remain one of the largest C3PAOs in the market right now as well over the last couple of years. But today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the CMMC and 32 CFR rule. So I will give, to start, kind of an overview of the CMMC program for those of you that may not be familiar or may want just kind of a firm foundation and firm level understanding of the CMMC program. We'll talk about the final rule. What's in it, and B, what's different from the proposed rule, which was released last December. So what's final now is slightly different than what was proposed. So we'll cover those. We'll talk about some challenges and cost considerations as the CMMC program gets rolled out. And then we'll talk about the assessment process and what's next for contractors, what contractors need to be considering as they pursue CMMC compliance and future DoD solicitations. But now I want to introduce the rest of our panel today. We're really excited to have Miss Stacy Busjanek join us from DoD, the CIO's office. She is the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Cybersecurity within the CIO's office. She is the leader of the CMMC program within the CIO's office and has been really critical, I believe, really responsible for shepherding the 32 CFR rule to final status, and is currently working on the 48 CFR rule, which is another rule associated with the CMMC program that will actually implement the CMMC program into solicitations. So we'll let Ms. Busjanek talk about that. So we're excited to have her representation here on the call. Eric Crucius is a partner at Holland & Knight. You've probably seen Eric present on CMMC if you're following it. He's well known on the circuit. He's been on the CMMC Cyber AB's town hall calls and is well known in speaking on cybersecurity. He focuses on government contracts and cybersecurity litigation for Holland & Knight, including bid protests, claims and disputes, compliance issues, and manages some pretty high stakes, complex commercial litigation as well. And then finally, we've got Bill Walter, who's a managing director at Forvis Mazars, our firm, and is the leader of our government contracting services advisory group and helps with cost accounting and various GovCon focused compliance matters as well. And as I mentioned, I'm a principal in our firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I lead our CMMC solutions group as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first CPE polling question. Just kind of curious to gauge the audience and see where everyone is with CMMC readiness and assessment. We'll talk about the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program, which was kind of an early adopter program of CMMC, which is being phased out and retired now in favor of actual CMMC assessments, forthcoming here, presumably by the end of the year, but potentially early next year. So just kind of want to see where everyone is so that we can hopefully focus on talking points that are most helpful to all of you as attendees. I think we'll give that here just another minute. Looks like results are starting to show up. Yep, and about as expected. We're still seeing folks getting ready, but glad to see that folks are starting to get ready for CMMC, the actual program getting rolled out. We do have some early adopters. It looks like there's some attendees that have gone through joint surveillance, which is great. We'll talk about the ecosystem bottleneck here in a little bit, what the anticipated availability of assessments to get assessments completed as the program rolls out, and then some that are looking to get assessments early here once the rule is actually in force. So looking forward to that. So as I mentioned, we don't want to spend a lot of time going over the CMMC program itself, but it is always helpful to have kind of a firm foundation of what what the program is before we start talking about expectations and what the rule details are and so forth. But effectively, CMMC is a program for the defense industrial bases supply chain, the DIB, protecting a specific set of information called Controlled Unclassified Information within DoD's supply chain. So DoD has continued to struggle with data breaches via its supply chain, and the previous sort of self-attestation, self-assessment model has not been working to mitigate that cyber breach risk. And so the CMMC program was founded 3 to 4 years ago, and it's just now being implemented. But the defense industrial base is estimated at over 200,000 companies by DoD's own calculations, and so there will be some level of CMMC compliance and status that will be required of that entire industrial base over the rollout period over the next several years. As I mentioned, the focus is on controlled unclassified information, CUI, but there is another type of information, federal contract information, which is also in scope for some of the lower level certification statuses that we'll talk about in just a second. And then finally, as I mentioned, the CMMC PMO exists within DoD's CIO's office. And so, but they have outsourced responsibility for management of the CMMC ecosystem to what's called the Cyber AB. So it's a third-party private enterprise that has a no-cost contract with DoD to help manage this, the assessor ecosystem, make sure the assessors are qualified and follow consistent quality control standards in order to complete the assessments. Currently, there are 60 authorized C3PAOs. That number continues to grow. We'll see that grow as the CMMC program rolls out, but that's a very limited number of assessment organizations. And similarly, the number of individual assessors that are qualified are pretty tight right now as well. So we'll talk about, again, ecosystem bottleneck, but just wanted to kind of lay the foundation there. And then as far as the levels, there are status levels within the framework. And we'll focus mostly on level 2, which is where the requirements for third-party assessment and the protection of CUI really come into play. And so there are estimated approximately 75,000 companies that will require a level 2 status. Most of those will require a third-party assessment by a C3PAO. Some will be able to self-assess. A much smaller percentage of that group will be able to self-assess, but that is really where the focus and impetus for the CMMC program lies, is in that level 2. Level 3 is special projects and programs. A fairly small number of contractors, defense contractors, are expected to adhere to that. DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, part of DoD itself will conduct those assessments, but level 2 is the focus. So now that I've laid the foundation, I kind of want to bring in our panelists to give us, frankly, just some opening thoughts, perspectives. Stacy, I'd love to start with you. Now that the 32 CFR rule is final, you've gotten it through. Give us your perspective on that process and what you see moving forward.
Well, first of all, woohoo! We finally made it, right? Because it's been a long road. We started this under a 48 CFR effort that the new administration, when the Biden administration came in, they were like, hey, we want to hold up a minute. We want to relook this program, make sure it's doing all the things we want it to do. And they decided to lessen the requirement and simplify it from where we were to make it easier because, we heard from the DIB that it was hard and that, I think the resoundingly, everybody finally had to go, yeah, we haven't that, a lot of companies haven't even begun the journey to get compliant. And so, CMMC is the validation of compliance. That's it. It's just validating that you've done what you said you were going to do in the 2017 with the 7012 clause. When you took that clause in your contract and signed up, you agreed to be compliant. So, but the road doesn't stop with this rule. So while this rule has finally been finalized and we expect it to become effective on the 16th of December, the team has already started working on its first revision of the rule, and that will be to bring in Rev 3 of the NIST 800-171 into the rule. When we were going through rulemaking, a lot of people asked us, why didn't you just say whatever revision of the And OMB said, not so fast. No, you're not allowed to do that. You will have to go through a full rulemaking process, including public comment period and everything, if you want to inculcate that Rev 3 into the rule. So we have embarked on that process today. We are already starting to work the efforts. And, what would that mean? When we do Rev 3, it'll probably be 1.5 to 2 years before that rulemaking process will be complete. We will have to update all of the assessor training and examinations for Delta to Rev 3, so to make sure that our ecosystem can adequately address that and work through those things. So the work never ends. And then on the other side of the program, we're working to get it implemented. And like you said, there's concern, right? People are like, oh, well, what if there aren't enough C3PAOs available? I think there are a lot of companies that haven't really begun their journey. Uh-oh, did I lose you?
Oh, I got you. You broke up there for a second, but well, that's interesting. While Stacy's kind of rejoining, just a quick overview. The NIST 800-171's Rev 2, as she described, a set of controls, is the current expectation, but it sounds like they're already looking at the next iteration of those controls, which introduce some technical changes, which is something to consider. Stacy, are you back with us?
I am. What was the last thing you heard?
We heard kind of talking about Rev 3 and the rulemaking process. I mean, what is the expectation, I guess, for the rollout of that set of controls? So contractors have been preparing for Rev 2. We're just getting started with CMMC. They're just looking to get assessments, and now we're already talking about Rev 3. I'm just curious what the timeline is for.
It'll be probably 2 years. We have to go through a full rulemaking process to be able to bring in the Rev 3. So we'll have to go through public comment. We'll have to do the whole regulatory impact analysis, the whole 9 yards. So it'll be at least 1.5 to 2 years. We'll have to update all the training for the assessors. All the assessors will have to be re-examined, have a Delta examination between Rev 2 and Rev 3, and roll out all the processes and procedures. So it is coming. And we've already actually working on, if a company today hasn't bothered to get Rev 2 compliant, and they say, I'm not even going to mess with Rev 2, I want to go to Rev 3, then we're going to have to what those things out of Rev 2 they have to look for, right? So if you're Rev 3 compliant, these are the ways to make sure that they're compliant with Rev 2, because they will be assessed against Rev 2 until that rule goes final. So no rest for the weary.
Well, and that's the idea behind cybersecurity, right? I mean, it's not a place you get to be comfortable and just let it go from there. It's constant iteration, constant improvement, evolution, and addressing new threats as they pop up. I think the
Right.
advantage to the 3 year certificate status life cycle of being 3 years is, the contractors that go through a CMMC assessment now and get the appropriate status level or level status they're looking for, they have time then to prepare for Rev 3 thereafter.
Yes.
So it's not
Yes.
like they have
And
to immediately right now start.
right. And there's going to be a crossover. There's going to be a time that if a company gets Rev 2 certified right before the Rev 3 rule comes out, that certification will still be good for 3 years. So you could get a Rev 2 certification right before the Rev 3 rule goes final and still be good for 3 years and be able to garner contract award, right? So we're trying to make, it's a lot of work on our part, but we're trying to make sure that it's an equitable thing. And 95% of the problem that we have in DoD is we've got to figure out how we stay and keep pace with the relevancy of the cyberspace, right? So rulemaking doesn't do that for you, where everybody should be to be keeping pace with the threat, and we're still on Rev 2. So we're always going to be playing a game of catch up, right? And so this is where
Yeah.
I get on my soapbox for national security, and this is your patriotic duty to get get out in front of your cybersecurity, right? Don't do it because the DoD or the rest of the federal government, because there is a CUI rule that's out right now for the FAR that's bringing CUI to, requirements to meet the NIST standards to the entire federal government. Don't do it because your government's telling you have to be able to work with us. Do it to protect your own data and information and intellectual property. I mean, so many of these companies, the defense industry, if China steals all your data, it's not as big of a deal as if you were Pepsi, right? Because the United States government's not going to go when we find out cheap, we'll just go there and buy it. We don't do that. We continue to buy our weapon systems from our US, and allied partners. Whereas if you were a commercial firm and you lost your intellectual property, China can steal it and start manufacturing that over there and sell it back to us, right? So for DoD and defense industry, it's not as painful if you lose your intellectual property because you still get the sale. What's painful is now my son and the Chinese son have the exact same aircraft flying against each other in armed combat. And I don't know about you, but I want my kid to have the better technology. I don't want him to be flying against my own technology stolen from me after all my tax dollars paid to develop it. And all they did was download it in 5 minutes and rebuild the exact same aircraft without doing any work. Right. But now my
And that's that's the impetus for the program, and I think it'll be effective. Eric, let me pivot to you and give you a shot at some opening thoughts. I know you've definitely looked through the rule, all 400 some odd pages of it.
I may have read it a couple of times, and can you hear me okay, Tom?
A couple of times?
Dude,
you need to get a
life. Hear you well.
Stacey, you're not the first person who's told me that, for sure.
You and Jacob Horn, do you guys get together on the weekends and talk about it? You're probably one of the only people that I know that's read it from tip to toe, I'll tell you.
The first weekend it came out, I did that, and I may have texted with Jacob a couple of times. But he's on the West Coast, so I don't see him too often. So for my in-person get-togethers, Tom is my person here.
East Coast, that's right.
He's a similar glutton for punishment.
Well, and you could cheat too, not to cut you off there, Eric, but the actual rule starts, I can't remember exactly where, but several, like 170 pages in or 270 pages in, as opposed to all the comments in the front. So just for the attendees that may have interest in it, you can save yourself some time.
Oh, you taught them how to cheat. That's not fair.
And Stacey, you may disagree, but I think the most interesting part of the rule is not actually the rule itself, but the comments that precede the rule, because it gives a hint on how DoD feels about things and the rule writers feel about things more so than the rule itself sometimes, although the rule is obviously vital to the whole process.
Well, yeah, the rule is what memorializes it, right? At the end of the day,
Right.
all the other stuff falls apart. But you do get a look, right? Now, there were some responses that I wanted to put that my team wouldn't let me. It was a line from Saturday Night Live, Jane. But anyway.
I do know that line. I think something that's really interesting at the jump for this, and I think we're going to talk about kind of the timeline here, but we have the rule effective date is going to be when the 48 CFR rule comes out, and some point after that day, or some point thereafter soon. Stacy could tell me I'm wrong, but I anticipate sometime in the spring of next year that rule will come out. And when that rule comes, yeah, go ahead, Stacy.
You're close, right? So the CMMC program will be effective 16 December. Right. However, the new Congress will have the look back ability. And then the 48 just completed public comment. We expect it to be tracking early spring, late spring, early summer of 25. Perfect.
Yeah. I don't, and this is Eric's personal opinion, I don't anticipate that Congress is going to care very much about this. This was a Trump administration initiative that continued under Biden. I think both parties have an interest in protecting this information from the Chinese, for instance. So I don't anticipate Congress taking a hard look at this like if it were some kind of labor policy or environmental policy where there could be some differences of opinion. But that's my personal opinion. But whenever the 48 CFR rule is finalized, it's going to represent a fairly significant change from where we are right now. Under the 7012 clause, of course, contractors really were supposed to have the 110 controls in place for Rev 2, NIST 800-171 Rev 2. And then subsequently we had the other DFARS clause, which required contractors to go in the supplier performance risk system and state how many of the controls they were compliant with. And oftentimes that was less than 110. In fact, I don't have the stats like somebody at DoD does, but I would say the vast majority of contractors put in a number that was less than perfect for that. But then DoD, has the option of doing business with those companies or not doing business with those companies, depending on their score. That's completely up to them. But when we have, so a company could have a score of a 50 or a 60, and DoD can still do business with them with the full knowledge that they have a score of 50 or 60. When phase 1 of CMMC is effective, as Stacy pointed out, obviously correctly, because she knows better than anybody else, the program is effective December 16th, but the contract hook to require contractors to do it as part of a contract, that will be effective in the spring. When phase 1 starts, when that is effective, it will require contractors in most instances to have a level 1 self-certification or a level 2 self-certification, depending on the information that they have. A level 2 self-certification requires compliance with at least 80% of the controls under NIST 800-171 Revision 2. Plus, there are certain controls that have to be complied with that are not part of that 20% that don't have to be complied with. And for the 80% that do, contractors have to have plans of action milestones and close them out within 6 months. So for contractors that are in that kind of 50 to 60 zone or lower, there is some work to do before the rule is finalized and effective, because once this is in contracts and a level 2 self-certification is required, there's a lot less give in the amount of controls that a contractor can be non-compliant with. So just something to think about. That's going to change right away, even before the rollout where C3PO assessments are required.
Did you ask me a question? If you did, I just reconnected. I'm having problems over here.
I did not. I said some things about you. I hope, no, I'm just kidding. I did not ask a question.
Jane?
I was merely talking about how when CMMC rolls out and is in contracts for the first phase, which requires its level 1 and level 2 self-certifications, there is going to be for level 2 a minimum score that isn't present right now, where a contractor could put in a SPUR score that's less than what would be required under CMMC.
88%, I believe, is where we are, isn't it? And so, yeah.
Yeah, 88 controls. Yep.
Yep. And so, it's interesting because you talked about the SPUR scores, right?
Mm-hmm.
in and put themselves in for a 110. And then the DIBCAC said, hey, we're going to come do a medium assurance review with you. And they quick went back in and they went down to a negative like 302 or something crazy. And the DIBCAC was like, now we're really interested in coming to talk to you, because I think when people first started entering their SPURS scores, it was much like the self-assessment of the 7012, where nobody's going to check. I'll just put myself down for a 110. I'm good to go, right? And I think the rigor that they went through when they were looking at the questionnaire was kind of like, hey, Bob, we got something that's multi-factor. Oh, okay, I can answer yes, right? And then all of a sudden, when somebody was coming to look, they're like, ooh, wait, what does that mean again? And then they finally did their full real assessment of where they are in the picture. And, you know, the beauty of the phased rollout is we still give self-assessment. I probably lost you again.
I hear you now, Stacy.
I'll keep going on like I was, right? So
yeah,
you
know, keep going, Stacy.
So the phased implementation gives everybody the opportunity to, no kidding, pay attention to what is required and do a true self-assessment, right? And you've got a year to really get it, you know, and until things are really going to start kicking in. And I really recommend everybody do a true. I lost it again.
I hear you, Stacy.
Okay, get help, right, from a consultant or whomever if you need it. Now, the other thing is we recognize that there are small businesses. I think I don't know how many people have heard John Garska's. We did a study over the summer, and he's identified companies who make less than $2 million of revenue a year fall under what they're calling the cybersecurity poverty line, right? The company doesn't have money to actually do the work. So there are a couple of things. There's a tax incentive that's going through Congress that we're supportive of in the department that would give companies less than 50 people an opportunity to get a tax break based on getting CMMC certified. And then we have several pilots. The Army has a pilot. The Office of Small Business Programs has a pilot. An environment, a cloud environment that would basically be CMMC. So companies would have a minimum requirement for their certification if they inherit all those capabilities that the cloud has. So we're trying to find ways for these small businesses to still participate and be part of the ecosystem, but get secure. I think, you know, the hard part is a lot of these companies didn't do anything before, and now they're hurting, right? They wake up and they're like, oh, I've got a quick amount of time to get certified. Now, the one thing with the joint surveillance, I don't know if you spoke about that when I was disconnected there for a minute.
Go for it.
All right. So with the joint surveillance, it will sunset. However, if you've gotten a joint surveillance and you've achieved your 110, or if you didn't and you closed out your POAMs, if you get your POAMs closed out, it will convert to a CMMC level 2 certification. Now, it will only last approved to the end of the 3-year time frame, right? But it's still good for 3 years. So if you got one last year, you got 2 more years that you're good, and you can compete for contracts that have a CMMC level 2 requirement in it.
I think that's very helpful. Did you see a lot of companies take advantage of that?
We did. We were lucky. I think they've done, I want to say, over 100 of them. And we had some of our bigs, like Raytheon and what have you, was one of the first companies that stepped out and said, we want to undergo a joint surveillance. And it was very helpful for both, I think, the C3PAOs and the DIBCAC to be together, right? It gave us some time to run out the process. And I think it also demystified it, right? You know, I think a lot of the times when these companies are having the assessors in, that they're coming to look to find some gotcha. And so after they go through it, they recognize it's very unobtrusive, right? They go in, they have them pull the requirements up on the screen. They say, hey, show me this, show me that. Okay, how do you handle this? Show me, your policy for that. And so it's not very obtrusive. And typically before the companies go in, and I don't know what Tom, experience was, but typically, they have a call with the company where they go through all the documentation, everything they're going to want to look at when they're there. And if you have policies now, you can send them over for them to look at before they get there. So it shortens the process on the ground, right? The time on station is reduced because they've done some of that pre-work. And so, we've been very lucky that that has been a great experience for everybody involved. I haven't had anybody have a heart attack over it. Everybody's had great things to say about the process and has been very satisfied so far. Now, I say that, I'll get some feedback that I didn't get before. Right?
And everybody's always happy. I know we're still stuck on the opening comment slide, and Bill, I'm not sure we've heard from you. Bill, do you have any thoughts on kind of what you've seen so far in the industry on CMMC and the new rule?
Well, yeah, from the cost accounting perspective, of course, the big question is who's going to pay for all this? And part of the reason, as Stacy was alluding to earlier, part of the issue with the rollout being delayed was to simplify the requirement for CMMC and cyber protection in order to help reduce the cost on small businesses. And so one of the things we've been talking about, the questions that comes in almost every time we talk is, okay, I'm going to have to pay thousands of dollars to get ready. I'm going to have to pay thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars to get ready, and the same to get certified. But if you've already built your forward pricing rates, if you've already built your elements of cost into the contracts that you've already awarded, the chances are, if you have a lot of fixed price type work, that's going to be paid for out of your profits. So with the rule coming in, people know they're definitely going to have to get ready. Stacy was cheering everybody on to get ready. It's coming. It's right around the corner. So now's the time to take some pulses and figure out, hey, what is this going to cost me to get fully prepared so that I can get a 100% score on this? And then what is it going to cost me to get my 3-year certification? And then how do I build that into my forward pricing rates so that I can actually recover the cost of the investment? So it's not a simple task. It's been delayed for a number of years. People are in a very competitive marketplace and dealing with government contracts. So it is going to be an issue that people need to think about and start trying to come up with their estimates for what this is going to cost so that they can plan appropriately moving forward.
So I have some thoughts about that, and I didn't get to hear everything because I had to refresh again. So one of the things when we started this, and undoubtedly, with the cyber poverty line and where we are, there's a lot of consternation over the cost. But when you look at cost accounting principles, right, and the fact that your enterprise or your enclave can be utilized by more than one program at a time, then it doesn't make good business sense for us to direct charge that, right? And so undoubtedly cost accounting standard says then you have to apply it as an overhead and G&A rate and build it into your rates to be able to recoup those costs over time. And so when we found out that companies weren't actually complying, then how do I now go back and start paying companies from here out to do it when there are some companies that actually did it, right? Because that would disenfranchise those that complied early, put it in their rates and bit the bullet. So we find ourselves in a tough spot, and the only fair way to go about it is to allow it to be recouped through overhead and G&A rates at this point in time. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I was going to jump ahead here to since we're getting here about 37 minutes in, I did want to touch a little bit more on the timeline. We've sort of talked about next spring for the 48 CFR rule, which will implement CMMC, but the 32 CFR rule kind of defines the rollout schedule and the 4 phases. Eric, I was wondering if you would kind of maybe walk us through this. And we've put together kind of a hypothetical based upon a March issuance of the 48 CFR rule. Sounds like it could be potentially a little bit later than that, but walk us through kind of the rollout schedule across the 4 phases.
Sure. As Stacy already eloquently kind of referred to, we have the 32 CFR rule that's already out. So starting December 16th, we could have assessments that are CMMC assessments that will last for 3 years, of course, with the off-year affirmations as well, assuming there are no changes to the system. But those assessments can start in earnest in just about a month from now. Then once that rule comes out, kind of to my initial thoughts that we talked about earlier, you will have to, for new solicitations, self-certify to level 1 and level 2 compliance and meet those metrics. For level 1, all controls have to be in place. For level 2, if you have controlled unclassified information, at least 80% of the controls have to be in place, which works out, as Stacy said, to 88 controls. And with that, you can have some plans of actions and milestones for certain controls when that happens. One big change from the draft version to this final version of the rule is phase 2 starts a year later instead of 6 months later. So we're talking late spring of 2026. Level 2 C3PAO third-party assessments will be required as a condition of award if you have controlled unclassified information. For the most part, there's a subset that would be satisfied with a self-certification, but the general default will be a third-party certification. So that's beginning just a year and a half from now, where a third-party certification will be required as a condition of award. There are abilities to push some of these deadlines back and put them in option years or accelerate them forward. What I'm talking to in this slide are kind of the default dates. And then a year later, phase 3, you have level 2 assessments, C3PO assessments required for option years for existing contracts, or level 3 DIB-CAC assessments. And that's a small subset of companies, about 1%, less than 1% the DIB. Well, at least that's DoD's guess. Will have to get a level 3 assessment on top of their level 2 assessment. And that's for highly controlled unclassified information that is of a nature that is very important to DoD. And then the final phase 4, is all contracts, all option years will have the full requirements for CMMC. I just want to know kind of a couple things on this timeline that could push it a little bit forward. The first is that companies in your supply chain may require a quicker timeline than is stated here. They want to be assured that they're not going to miss out on contracts. They want to be assured that their supply chain is safe. That's a decision between a prime contractor and a sub, or a higher tier sub and a lower tier sub, whether or not they want to require a CMMC sooner. And now that CMMC assessments can occur, higher tier contractors can require it of their subcontractors if they choose. If there's a subcontractor willing to do it, certainly that's something that they can agree to. And I would note that if you have 2 subs competing for the same work with a prime, one sub has a CMMC certificate and one doesn't, well, we could guess which direction that prime contractor is going to go for. There's also kind of some notes in the rules that would allow DoD to push the timeline up sooner if they want to. That would be subject to a bilateral agreement with the contractor and DoD, but that's also a possibility. So I just want to note that this is a timeline. I expect that this will be the timeline, but there are instances where that timeline can either accelerate or slip a little bit. All to say, you should move quickly if you can to try to get up to speed, because this will be here before we know it. Tom?
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Eric. Certainly appreciate that. And you're absolutely right. We're kind of seeing a lot of pressure from the primes on down the supply chain to go ahead and get started right now, or at least have someone I spoke with this morning is being expected to start getting prepared and be able to demonstrate that to their prime. So there's certainly the forward pressure outside of the rule itself. I think we had a polling question somewhere in here. I want to jump. Something we really haven't even talked about just yet are the role of MSPs, managed service providers, as it relates to CMMC readiness. And Stacy, once we get through this polling question about our attendees' use of the MSPs, I want to get your perspective on kind of how you shaped that, because there's a little bit of difference between the proposed rule and the final rule as it relates to CMMC certification expectation for contractors, for MSPs. But this effectively, we're just kind of, are you there?
Okay.
Stacy, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can now. Yes, I can. Oh, you keep breaking up.
Okay,
can you hear
great.
me?
Well, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, you're frozen again on the screen. That's what it is.
Okay. Well, we're going through this polling question. We're talking about MSPs, managed service providers, and Eric, I'll probably pivot to you here in just a second too. But as results start to pop up on the screen, the expectation was that MSPs, managed service providers, any third party that supported a CUI environment or CUI handling operation inside of a contractor, was going to need to have a certificate of status at the very same level as the contractor themselves. That has evolved a little bit, and that's not necessarily the requirement. That's frankly one of the larger changes in the proposed rule. And as I look at the results of the polling question here before we dive into the conversation on it, I see that there's a fairly large percentage that really haven't engaged MSPs yet on that. And I think it's especially important now because MSPs may not need to have a certificate, but they're still involved with your compliance as a contractor for your CMMC compliance. So Eric, you want to maybe kind of highlight your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, so it's good news and bad news in a way. It's really good news that managed service providers of all kinds don't need to have a CMMC certificate, because there's a wider range of MSPs that are available to contractors to use to store this information. But contractors should kind of keep in mind that if they have any kind of CUI on them or connection to your CUI system, they can be part of the scope of a CUI assessment. So whatever is connected to your system will have to be compliant with the controls that are relevant for that connection. Also note that if a MSP, now that they don't have to get a level 2 assessment, we have to be careful, buyer beware of which MSP you're using. Make sure you ask the hard questions as far as, do they have the right controls in place? Are they doing the things the right way? Where if they're managing your security, or if they're managing your anything else, your information, that they won't kind of submarine you when it comes time to get an assessment done. Before, with the proposed rule, you had kind of that good housekeeping seal of approval because they had a level 2 assessment. Now that's not there, and in a way that's really great news, because the door is open for a lot more MSPs. They could probably provide this service at a lower cost than they would have if they had to go get an assessment. But on the other hand, that makes contractors have to take some of that responsibility and make sure that MSP that they're seeking to use is the right MSP for the kind of controls that they need to have in place.
And typically what we see, and certainly with certification to begin with, was through a shared responsibility matrix of sorts, which effectively was a list of all the requirements of NIST 800-171. And then each requirement, there was a description of, is this a responsibility of the contractor, or has this been offloaded to the MSP? Or is there some sort of shared responsibility, and having that described and having that documentation prepared as part of your sort of pre-assessment process is going to be really critical when you engage a C3PAO to conduct the assessment.
And Tom, I would just add to that, if an MSP doesn't know what you're talking about with that and haven't been ready for an assessment, that is a good sign right there that they're not the right MSP for you.
Well, and that's why we sort of asked the polling question there a second ago, and it was, we frankly got a larger percentage of contractors that haven't engaged just yet on that. So that's certainly something, I think, a takeaway for everybody on the call here. Make sure that you've identified all relevant MSPs, third-party service providers, and are looping them in to your compliance readiness. And Stacy, are you back with us?
I've been freezing and unfreezing over here. So, you know, it was interesting when we were doing the proposed rule and we got the comments. One of the comments was, why are you going to make an MSP that only handles logs that are not CUI have to rise to the level of getting a CMMC level 2 certification? And the other funny thing was we had a lot of people say, well, they got through the comments so fast they must not have made any changes. Ha! Yes, we did. And that was a big change that we made, was that we did recognize that we may have been a little bit over the top and too restrictive. But you're right. Now, you know, so in one vein, we're satisfying and pleasing a group of commenters that felt like we were being over the top. On the other side of the that are looking for an MSP, they need to be understanding what they're putting through that MSP, what that MSP handles, and if it's more than just the logs and they're processing or transmitting or storing any of your CUI, they're inbounds and they need to be part of the ecosystem. So companies need to understand what they're doing. It's not going to be an easy button just to pick an MSP. You're going to have to understand what you're doing.
It's an easier button.
It's an cheaper button, but you as buyer beware, like you said, Eric, right? You need to understand what your network is comprised of. And, you know, we were talking about cost earlier with Bill. We've seen at DibCAC, right? Back when John Ellis was still part of the group before he decided to quit and go renew his house in St. Louis. The DibCAC saw a company get 110 perfect score for $5,000. And what, you know, they say the cost driver is how complex you make your own network, right? So if you are simplistic in the way you do your network, if you standardize on one computer type and you set a baseline, you know, I mean, there are certain things that people do that I've heard that trip themselves up, like companies that decide, oh, Lenovo's on sale this week, I'll go get one of those. Oh, Dell's on sale this week, I'll go get one of those. And then they get themselves tied up in knots because they can't establish that baseline. And so, you know, part of this is thinking through what you've done to yourself with your network, understanding it, right? And I think getting your C-suite, that's why you put that affirmation in there to kind of recognize what they've asked the poor IT guys to do. A few bucks here and a few bucks there to get them a system that works, right? So if you have a defined architecture, you can do it for pretty cheap and get certified and be 110. But you got to know what you're doing.
Well, we haven't talked about affirmations just yet, but I definitely want to here in just a second. And Eric, I know that's something of, you know, from a legal perspective, that's certainly a highlight for you and something you're counseling your clients on. But just real quick, a couple of other big changes here as we've got about 10 minutes left. Just quick changes in the proposed rule, or the final rule from the proposed rule. We've talked about the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program, JSVAs, which were, as I mentioned, the early adopter program. Those, by text in the rule, will convert to level 2 certifications, assuming all they were completed with a 110 score. DibCAC is handling that. We're still kind of waiting on exactly what that looks like, but that's the expectation here for all the JSVA participants. And as a result, the JSVA program is effectively now retired. They're not scheduling any more new assessments here, with the anticipation of actual level 2 assessments starting at the end of this year or first thing next year. We did talk about Rev 2. We've tried, Stacy, you jumped on it pretty quickly here on the call. Rev 2 lives on for now, but we do expect here, it sounds like within the next probably 18 to 24 months, Rev 3 will introduce some new cybersecurity controls into the CMMC framework that contractors need to think about. But then the good news is as well, you know, the life cycle of a certificate of status is 3 years. So if you go through the Rev 2 right now, you've got that locked in for 3 years, and you can start to prepare for Rev 3 at the for your next full assessment with assuming a C3PAO is required. But then here in that fourth bullet, we're talking about the off years with the affirmation process. And Erica, again, I want to jump quickly to you. Maybe in 2 minutes, can you walk us through what the affirmation process looks like, the importance and implications of that?
You said 20 minutes, right? Okay. So because the CMMC third-party assessment is good, for 3 years, it has to happen every 3 years. There are those 2 other years in between. During those 2 years, contractors will have to file affirmations that say, hey, our system is the same. We're maintaining it to the same standards we had when the assessment was done, and the scope of our system is the same. Now, if the scope of the system has changed through M&A activity, upgrades to the system, what have you, you can't file an affirmation like that. So that means you have to get a new assessment. And I would recommend having that old system on side by side with the new system until the new system is properly assessed. So there's not a break in kind of assessments, because you do have to notify DoD if your system is no longer proper based on the assessment it received. I also note that affirmations are required annually for level 1 and after a successful C3PAO assessment and after POAM closeout of that C3PAO assessment if you have POAM. So there are fairly frequent affirmations that are required, and this is important under the False Claims Act, because you as a company are affirming something to the Department of Defense, and they're doing business with you based on that affirmation, based on the fact that you're saying something in that affirmation. So it's really important that that affirmation be accurate and correct and done with the full knowledge of the company. Certainly not a weekend project, as we like to say. Back to you, Tom.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. I mean, affirmations, I think, are kind of important. I've heard it compared to, the SOX attestation program, when the Sarbanes-Oxley rule came out and became, federal requirement. It's very similar. There is a signature of an individual within the contractor that's signing, yes, we are fully compliant here. As you talked about, Eric, there's legal implication of that, False Claims Act, and so forth. So certainly something to take serious at the higher levels of a contractor. And Stacy, I think, as you were alluding to, not just what the IT administrator is trying to put into place.
No, and the main reason we came up with the affirmation, twofold, right? So you do have that, okay, you've asserted, right? Because what we found with the self-assessments under the 7012 was a wink and a nod, and we really didn't get what we thought we were. And 2, we wanted to make sure that there was recognition and understanding from the C-suite level that IT and cybersecurity should not be your afterthought. Right? You need to step up. You need to take care of it. Cybersecurity is an important facet of your business. And so we want to make sure that there's recognition through all levels of the company that this is something important and should be tracked and managed and understood.
Yep. Closing out here, where we opened up that cybersecurity is an ongoing maturity process. It's not a state that you get to, you don't achieve the certificate and it's over.
And I'm gone again.
There needs to be continuous improvement. But, well, before we wrap up, we've got the fourth polling question to close out with, but I do want to give everybody kind of a chance to give some, a minute or two of final thoughts. Bill, why don't we haven't heard from you in a second? Why don't you go ahead and give us your thoughts?
All right. Thanks, Tom. The thoughts are, we spend a lot of time in industry trade associations, and I focus a lot on the cost accounting, but CMMC compliance is a big concern for companies. And Stacy and I were talking before the webinar here. It's really an opportunity for companies to take the bull by the horns and get it going. So when you do look at it, there are a lot of economical ways to do it. Stacy mentioned a 5K person. I was speaking at a conference over the weekend, and there are several representatives from the local small business groups had identified with the resources that the DoD has made available, with other resources, they've been able to do it very economically. The key thing is you got to focus and you got to put it on your to-do list and get it done. So with that, Tom, it's off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. Eric, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I do want to kind of, Stacy alluded to this earlier, and I think we all did, kind of what small businesses should do, because there's a lot of companies out there that don't do a ton of business with DoD, that maybe are small themselves and don't have the resources. There are kind of strategies that you can use. There's the virtual desktop strategy that was plainly pointed out in the final rule, which is really helpful, where a high-tier contractor can share information with you without it getting on your IT system, to avoid having to get a CMMC certification. And then there are these other resources like Project Spectrum that DoD has rolled out. But there is also, as Stacy kind of talked about, the system for $5,000. It is possible to have lower cost systems if you just kind of make the system as small as possible, just to hold the information it needs to hold that needs to be protected. So all is not lost for small businesses out there, I would say. And just, you know, if you have any questions, you could reach out to any of us about that.
Absolutely. Stacy, any parting wisdom from DoD?
Yes, of course. I could not.
Of course.
So I think, you know, everybody resoundingly has said we need to get off our duff and get this done, right? And, you know, this is where I get on my soapbox. This is a national security priority. We lose billions and trillions of dollars every year in intellectual property theft. And if you're not thinking, nobody wants my data, I'm not that important, think about a couple of other things. These guys aren't just looking to take your data. They're looking to get your business information. I met a guy down in South Carolina one year. He lost 40 grand because he didn't have his system protected, and somebody got in and changed the cage code information, and his payment went to their... And the government doesn't have another $40,000 to give you to make you whole. That guy's out of luck. And who is he going to go to complain, to go after these people? Department of Justice? They're not going to be bothered for $40,000. They've got bigger fish to fry, right? So you've got your own personal identity, your account identity, your business identity. This is, and CMMC in the 171 is the crawl, people. It is just the baseline. It doesn't protect you against state actors. You got to get to the 172 level to do that. You know, when I talk to people that are true cyber geeks, which I am not, they're like, Stacy, the 171 is almost like what you should do at home to make sure your neighbors can't watch your Netflix, right? It's the basic kind of things to protect yourself. And we were talking before the webinar started, how many of us have had our social security numbers stolen, right? And so that against us. And so that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it now and let you guys finish out.
Well, thank you, Stacy, and a big thank you to you for joining us. I know you're busy over there at DoD. You've got a lot going on, obviously, with the 48 CFR rule coming as well. And Bill, Eric, definitely appreciate your participation, your perspectives, and thank you to all the attendees today. We had a couple of technical glitches today, but thanks for sticking with us. And I know we've got some great questions that we didn't get through as well. So we will pull those down, and Bill and I will work through them, and we'll try and make sure the right party reaches out to everybody. So with that, I will thank everybody, thank all of our attendees, and wish all of you a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks a lot. You guys take care.
Thank you, everybody.